Am I on? I guess I have to switch on the speaker. Just a second, people. But you can say that it's not a live state of right. Sutra. So for the people at home, I just changed the angle of the camera because I have people sitting here. So it would be awkward kind of for the camera to be here and speak to people here. Anyway, or it kind of, it would be awkward. It would be complicated anyway. The Heart Sutra, not this. Upper straight to the Arya triple gem. Thus do you hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling on the massive Valcha mountains in Rajgir, together with a great community of monks and a great community of Bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in concentration in categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon a very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of the Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding the five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, composition, factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness without characteristics, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no composition of factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element and so on up to including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. Therefore, there is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, Bodhisattvas rely on the well and perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration, without fear. Having completely passed beyond error to reach the aim point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awakened to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in relying on perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of the great knowledge, the mantras, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequal, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering should be known as truth, it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata om gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhisoha. Shriputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, to train in profound perfection of wisdom like that. And then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that, it is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom just as you have indicated, even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Vadiputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvaras, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. We go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the highest assembly. By the accumulations that I collect by listening to the teachings, may I attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the highest assembly. From the accumulations I collect by listening to teachings, may I attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the highest assembly. From the accumulations I collect by may I attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit all sentient beings. All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I thought of just continuing with the arguments that we posit in our mind in resisting the practice of equalizing and exchanging self with others. So today we finished covering those arguments, and we also looked at the last argument, which basically is saying that, but if you meditate a lot on compassion, it will make you unhappy. If you think of others suffering, you'll become depressed. And since we do not want to suffer, what's the point in thinking of others suffering? I think that this is a question that comes quite often in teachings. How do you not get tired or worn out, being brought down when you meditate on compassion? So we'll cover that. It's good. I think that it's a good explanation that Geshe-la gave, and also the one that, of course, we have in the text. But before we get back to it, on the way down, I was thinking that if we've been speaking about equalizing self with others, but still in our mind, we need to be clear about what is the procedure to meditate on the equality of self with others. So in that sense, if we posit a question in our mind in the following way, if I have to describe in 3 or 4 sentences the way to meditate on the equality of self and others, how would I describe it? So try to be as concise as you can, but also as precise as you can with respect to what is the essence of meditating on self and self with others. So think about it for a couple of minutes, or kind of leave it as an open question in your mind. As I go into what I wanted also to do is just to read through the summary of Lama Tsongkhapa, summarizing the way to deal with the first obstacle for developing the equality of self and others, and thinking that self and others are as different as yellow and blue. So I'll just share it with you guys at home. So there are 2 obstacles to training in the attitude of exchanging self and others. So here it is for the equality of self with others. You make a categorical differentiation between people who are happy or suffering, yourself and others, making them as different as blue and yellow. Then you accomplish your own happiness and remove your own suffering because you think of them as mine. And you neglect others' happiness and suffering because you think of them as belonging to others. Therefore, the remedy for this is not to make, the remedy for that is not to make a categorical distinction between self and others as being essentially different. Essentially different as if kind of we're independently different. Rather, understand that self and others are mutually dependent, such that when you're aware of self, you're aware of others. And where you are aware of others, you are aware of self. It is like being aware of near mountains and distant mountains, for example. Relative to your being here, you think of a mountain there in the distance as being a distant mountain. Yet when you go to this distant mountain, you think of it as a near mountain. So the awareness of self and other is not like the awareness of a color, for regardless of what color blue is related to, you are aware of just blue and are not aware of some other color like yellow. Thus, Shantideva indicates that self and other are merely posited in relation to a particular reference point and do not essentially exist, which means that they do not exist in and of themselves, but self and others are dependent on each other. So that's the way to, a summary of the way to overcome the first obstacle in thinking that self and others are unrelated. So why should I meditate on wanting to kind of thinking of my body as being the body of everyone and me being everyone, and thus wishing me as others, as wanting to know, why do I wish me to be happy and me to not to suffer? So that's the first obstacle. Now, with the second obstacle, we said that it's mainly in thinking that I don't understand what I need to meditate on the suffering of others or wishing others to be free from suffering, because other suffering actually doesn't harm me. Yesterday, I believe that we finished off in the Chut in looking at verse 98. So I wanted to look at the summary. So first of all, in verse 97, the objection that was put forward, the argument is, currently I do not suffer. I don't have to protect myself from others' suffering because their suffering does not harm me. That's the basic argument. The reply is that even if you're not suffering at the present, you still protect yourself from future suffering. For example, you contribute to your super when you're young in order to protect yourself, in order to be protected, let's say, to be protected from poverty, and to enjoy yourself when you're old. So in thinking that currently I do not suffer and others suffering do not harm me, well, we do protect ourselves from suffering even if we don't suffer at the moment. So that's the first argument. Then we started to look at verse 98. Actually, we finished it, I think. So it says, the argument is, protecting myself from future suffering is different to protecting me from others' suffering. I have to protect myself from suffering even if I'm currently doing fine, because if I don't do so, I will experience suffering in the future. So that's what we all do, right? We all think that I need to protect myself from future suffering. I need to accumulate enough money for the future. I need to make sure that I have good education. I need to make sure that I'm healthy, because if I don't, I will experience more pain and suffering in the future, and I need to protect myself from suffering. But since, and then the argument is, protecting myself from future suffering is different from protecting me from others' suffering. Again, when we think about it in terms of thinking of I or mine as being everyone else. So the reply is, in so saying, your idea that the person that you are now will be the one who will be experiencing suffering in the future. This is the argument. This is how we think of this argument. No, I'm protecting myself from suffering in the future because it will be me that will experiencing suffering. And the overall feeling that we have when we think of it would be me that will be experiencing suffering, it is exactly this body and it is exactly this person that will be experiencing suffering. So first of all, when we think about it in terms of this life, me being 70-year-old or 50-year-old, my God, I'm going to burst into tears. Almost 50. So me being 50 years old is not the same person as me being 49 years old. So the aggregates have changed, the person have changed. And even more so when we think of a more drastic change of going from one lifetime to the next. If I'm born as a human being, let's say that I'm born not as a man, but as a woman. So definitely the physical aggregate would be different. So the suffering of Katsun as a man is not the suffering that I will be in the future. No, the woman that I will be in the future. If I'm born as a dog, as a parrot, as a guppy, as a fish, or what have you, the suffering that I will experience in those states of existence would not be the suffering that I experience now as Yaki. So that's the notion that's the argument that Shantideva puts forward here. In so saying, the idea that the person that you are now will be the one that will be experiencing suffering in the future. This is a mistake. You will be other. You will be different to the person you are now. You might even take a completely different birth in future lives. So what's the point in saying that? Well, the point in saying that is that we think that this is me and they are other. Other suffering does not harm me. Shantideva said that, but you will be an other in the future. You will be other in the future, and now you're doing things, you're taking actions in order to protect the other you from future suffering. So this argument does not work. And furthermore, he says, the person you will be in the future, in your future life, will be other than the person in this life. Continuity still exists, but the aggregates will be different, not the same. All there is a conventionally existing self. Being merely imputed. Not the one that we strongly cling to when we think of the suffering person we will be in the future, right? So there will still be a conventionally existing person that will experience suffering in the future, but it's not the one that we concoct of at the moment in thinking that I, as inherently existing I, will experience suffering in the future. So that's the gist of the argument presented in verse 98. Now let's look at the argument in verse 99. If whenever there is suffering, that itself must protect from that. The suffering of the foot is not that of the hand. Why then does it protect from that? Just quickly looking at the outline, verse 99. It's still part of establishing the pervasion in dispelling objection to this equation. So I'm going to look at this commentary, the Nectar of Manjushri's speech. An opponent might object that it is those who suffer who should protect themselves when they are injured. It is not for others to do so, in a sense that if you suffer, it's your own business, it's not my business. Why is it my business to protect you? But the pain that the foot feels when it is pierced by a thorn is not only felt by the hand. So what reason does the hand have for protecting it? It does not make sense. So the argument here is saying that if you say that since I and other, you could say are unrelated, and also other suffering do not harm me, and therefore others need to protect themselves. I don't need to do anything in that sense. Then Shantideva says the hand and the leg are different, they are other, but we still use the hands in order to take out a thorn that pierced the foot. If you maintain that argument that because there are others, they need to protect themselves and I do not need to do anything in order to protect them, you'll have the fallacy of not using your hands in order to remove pain in your leg. So of course, there are still objections to this line of argumentation. So in the following objection in verse 100, it says, Although this may not be reasonable, it is engaged due to apprehending a self. The response, whatever unreasonable self and others should at all costs be abandoned. So let's look at what this argument says. Such protective acts may not be logical. The opponent will continue, in a sense that we still resist, we still dig our heels in saying that it is not logical to protect others. However, it says, nevertheless, because people are habituated to self-clinging, they are mutually oriented in such a way that in the present life, they protectively provide for their future existence, and the body's limb look after each other. So Shantideva replies that the inadmissible clinging to I and other, or alternatively interpreted, that which is inadmissible to oneself and others, namely suffering, should be discarded as much as possible, for it is a delusion. So let's look at my tutorial note just to summarize that. Sorry. Others who suffer, no, sorry. I still think that I don't need to protect others. However, I admit that my body in this life and the body of future lives are indeed other. So that's the argument that Shantideva put forward before. It says actually, when you think of not needing to protect other, the person that I am in this life and the person that will be in the future are other. The body that I have now and the body that I have in future life are other. But it is right for me to protect myself and the body from future suffering because I'm thoroughly familiar with grasping at I and mine. So although kind of we say that, so the argument that Shantideva presents here is saying that, yeah, I agree that they are other, but still I have grasping at a self. Because I grasp at I and I grasp at mine, because I grasp at I and I grasp my body, and I become so familiar with that, it is reasonable to protect me, and it is reasonable to protect me from suffering, or to protect my body from suffering. So the reply of Shantideva is saying that grasping at I and mine are wrong consciousnesses and are to be discarded, are to be abandoned. That's the fourth argument. Now, let's look at the fifth one in verses 101 and 102. Let's first of all look at those verses. That called continuum and collection are like falsities such as a rosary and an army. The possessor of suffering does not exist. Who has control over this? The honor of suffering being non-existent, there can be no distinction at all. Because it is suffering, I shall dispel it. Actually, because it is suffering, I shall dispel it. That belongs, I think, to another section. There's no argument that is stated here explicitly, but still, if you formulate an argument in relation to that, you could say that I protect myself because the person that I will be in the future will be a result of the person that I'm now. It is okay to use, so in that sense, you can say that there is a continuity of cause and effect. I'm speaking about someone that belongs to the same continuum. Also, when I speak about the hands protecting the legs, removing pain from the leg, I speak about things that belong to the same continuum, to the same collection. And the implication here is that self and others do not belong to the same collection, or self and others are not the same continuum. The argument here is not stated overtly or explicitly, but it seems that this is what Shantideva is getting at. So if someone says that it is okay for me to protect myself because me and my future lifetimes will belong to the same continuum, it is all right for my hand to protect the leg, although they're other because they belong to the same continuum. Again, here Shantideva says, we have an idea of continuum and collection as being things that exist in and of themselves independently. But they are merely imputed by names. They are merely designated, merely imputed. And as such, we call them falsities. So falsities are things that do not exist in the way that they appear. They appear in one way, but they do not exist in that way. So my body appears to exist inherently, but it doesn't exist in that way. It is false. Similarly, you can say that the person that I'm now and the person that I will be in my future lifetime, when I think about it, it seems to be that Katsun, Yaki, that guy, that monk, and so forth, will be the one that will be experiencing suffering in the future. Or even more so, there is kind of the underpinning of this appearance is that there is an inherently existing I that will be there in the future and unchanging. The same person as me now, that will be the core of me that will be experiencing those future suffering. So this collection or this continuity is said by Shantideva to be a falsity. They are merely imputed by name. If you look for them, you're not going to be able to find anything as such. So I look at my tutorial notes. So me and my body in past and future lives are indeed other. The foot and the hand are indeed other. But the former, or the formers, which means me and my body in past and future lives. So the formers belong to the same continuum, and the latter, which means my foot and my hand, to the same collection. Therefore, they are related. So the suggested implication here is that the self and other are not like that. They're not related like that. It's not a stated argument, but it seems that is the implication. The reply is that collection and continuum are phenomena which are merely imputed as such. They are falsities and untrue. Since suffering self and suffering others are the same in being empty of inherent existence, and their experience of suffering is the same in being painful. So mind suffering and your suffering is just the same in being an experience of suffering. There's no difference between my pain and your pain in just being an experience of pain. Of course, there could be different levels of pain. There could be different reasons of pain. But when we just look at the subjective experience of discomfort, displeasure, pain, and so forth, there is no difference. So therefore, since the suffering self and suffering others are the same in being empty of inherent existence, and their experience of suffering is the same in being painful, there is no difference between them. So to that, the commentary says, again, the opponent would say that although previous and subsequent existences do not constitute a single entity, they do form a continuum. Although the hand and the foot are separate, nevertheless, they form a single composite. This is why one protects the other. But Shantideva replies that what the opponent calls a single continuum or a composite are illusions. A continuum is nothing more than the coming together of many instances, nothing else. In the same way that the many beads of a chaplet are identical as the single string or continuum of the mala. As for the composite, this is just a gathering, as when many armed men grouped together are called an army. An army is a figment. It is just an imputation or name that does not exist as such. This is the best way to establish the personal no-self or selflessness, right? So when we think of, for example, a mala rosary, in trying to find the mala within the beads, or thinking about the army and trying to find the army within the individual soldiers, or thinking of forest and trying to find the forest within each one of the trees, then it says this is the best way to establish the personal no self, to look for something and see whether we are able to find it. Aside from the self believed to be single, permanent, and independent, all assumptions of I or self are associated with a continuum or gathering. So a sense of self is connected with a continuum or a collection of different parts. Since the latter are not established, which means a collection or a continuum are not established, the self is shown to be non-existent. Since continuum and gathering have no existence in themselves, there's no experiencer of the suffering, no personal self to possess the pain. Who owns it? No one. So of course, conventionally we do suffer. Doesn't say that there is no person that experiences suffering. We do experience suffering. We exist as beings that experience pleasure or pain. But ultimately, there is no experiencer of suffering. And therefore, this notion that I need to protect myself because there is a continuity of person, or because there is a collection here, is based on this assumption that the collection and continuum exist in and of themselves independently, and this is not correct. So to that, verse 102 says, if there is no subject, no experiencer of the suffering felt, there is no means of distinguishing between I and other. For if there is no I, no other can be posited in contrast with it. I mean, here we're speaking about ultimate level. If there's no ultimately existing I, there's also no ultimately existing other. Since neither of them exists, there is no basis for a distinction, and therefore no difference between our pain and others' pain. For this reason, it is illogical to protect ourselves from suffering and not to protect others from it. In view of this, it is demonstrated that since suffering is something to be dispelled, the suffering of others are to be dispelled along with our own. For the simple reason that pain is pain. What grounds are there for getting rid only of our own suffering and not of others' suffering? It would be a great delusion to think there were. So with that, we can go back to the two syllogisms that were drawn previously. Where were they? Anyway, I lost what I wanted to say. There was the syllogism that says, take suffering sentient beings. I blacked out. Anyway, erase that. I'll have to look at it again. Anyway, what Shantideva says here is that sentient beings, I need to protect sentient beings because they suffer. Just like I need to protect myself because I suffer. And there's no difference between my suffering and other suffering. I need to protect them because they're suffering. That's what it comes down to. So with that, we've covered the extensive argumentation that overcomes the two obstacles for exchanging oneself with others. Let's look just at the synopsis of that in the last two lines of verse 102 and then verse 103. If I avert it, I should avert all. If not, I'm just like sentient beings. Sorry. Because it is suffering, I shall despair it. Therefore, what is the point in that? There is an objection. Why should I avert the suffering of all? The response is, there's no ground for argument. If I avert it, I should avert all. If not, I'm just like sentient beings. Right? So I should avert all suffering because they're suffering. Because it is suffering, I shall dispel it. Actually, that was the argument I was looking for. So I'm wondering if you guys at home or you guys here have any questions? Jason, can we say that others are part of us, and when others suffer, we suffer? And it's correct to relieve that suffering. I think that this is what Shantideva does here when he explains the way to meditate on the equality between self and others. He says that if we train our mind in thinking of ourselves as others, then others will become part of us, part of me. And therefore, since I want to be free from suffering, it is logical to avert suffering for me, which now I think of as me and others. Also, Jane says, would it be right to assume that because we have partial compassion mixed with attachment, we need to be on the progressive path to impartial compassion towards the ultimate bodhicitta of bodhisattvas? And that's a method of the sevenfold cause and effect, together with exchanging self and others, are stepping stones to achieving impartiality. The step of impartial compassion is in relation to others. First of all, I agree with what you say, Jen, that all of us have impartial compassion. In fact, no, all of us have compassion, at least have the seed of compassion. We can, I think, see that in different instances in our life, particularly, I guess, that when you're a parent, and definitely you have, most cases, majority of cases, have the sense of deep love and compassion towards your child. So we have that. We have other instances of that in our relationship with other people, but also sometimes with pets or other living beings. So we have that, but as Jen said, it is partial in that it is mixed with attachment. So if we have partial compassion, it means that it is juxtaposed with impartial compassion. They exist in relation to each other. So we need to be on the progressive path to impartial compassion towards the ultimate bodhicitta of bodhisattvas. Well, we need to be on a progressive path to impartial compassion, in a sense that we use our partial compassion now and we change it to be impartial. So when you think of the development of, first of all, equalizing self with others, but also the practice of equanimity, which we've spoke about yesterday in the shoot, in which you think of friends, enemies, and strangers. So we use the compassion and care that we have for those who are close to our heart, and we extend it to others. We think that just as we care for those who are close to our heart, we want to include more in the circle of people that we care for. So also strangers and those that are our enemies. So we are, you could say, we need to be on a progressive path to impartial, to extend our partial compassion to the point in which it becomes impartial. Do we extend it towards the ultimate bodhicitta of bodhisattvas? Well, it depends on, if you take ultimate bodhicitta in a very strict sense to be a perceptual realization of emptiness in the continuum of Arya Mahayanis, well, I would say no, because we don't change or we don't transform compassion to be ultimate bodhicitta, ultimate man of enlightenment. But if you take ultimate bodhicitta here in a general way, it's like, the final mind of enlightenment of bodhisattvas, in the sense that it is uncontrived, it is spontaneous, it is very deep, it is deeply based on compassion, then yes, this kind of we work towards this kind of final compassion of bodhisattvas. So that's the first part of the question. And that the method of the sevenfold cause and effect with exchanging self and others are the stepping stones to achieving impartiality. Well, yes and no. In order to practice the sevenfold cause and effect personal instructions well, you need to develop impartiality as a basis for this practice. So that's why impartiality is said to be a precursor for meditating on the recognition that all sentient beings have been mothers. But when we look at that from the viewpoint of equalizing and exchanging self with others, then in order to develop this great care for others, great compassion to others, which is the foundation of bodhicitta, we first of all need to create the basis in terms of equalizing oneself with others. So creating that sense of impartiality. But then looking at our current state, I think that when all of us on a practical level take that into our daily practice, even if we haven't for the time being developed an absolute impartial compassion or impartial loving kindness to others, we can still complete the practices of equalizing, exchanging self with others, and or the sevenfold cause and effect personal instructions, and let the latter stages of, for example, in the sevenfold cause and effect personal instructions. So we have loving kindness and compassion and the wholehearted resolve. So I think that probably if we meditate on them, in some sense, they also contribute to our impartiality with respect to sentient beings, although impartiality to sentient beings should have been meditated upon beforehand. So given that it's still for us work in progress, that one meditation alone will not cut it, the more we meditate on it, and the more we meditate on the latter stages, the more also the early stages will, I think, become deep and profound or effective. So then this type of impartial compassion in relationship to others. I think that, yeah, I think that I've answered it. I hope so, Jane. So Oli says, as I will be the other in future life, it is only logical to remove suffering for others and myself when I have the opportunity. Yeah, I think that this is what Shantideva is drilling here again and again, kind of change your idea about self with others, kind of don't be so restricted in your application of that. If you think of yourself as also other, and then you will accustom to thinking that I need to remove the suffering of myself and other, as you yourself are also other. So just to summarize these two sections, I will look again at Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, the second obstacle. You must remove the obstacle of thinking, I will not make effort to dispel others' suffering because other suffering does not harm me. So it would be like not accumulating wealth in your youth out of fear of suffering in your old age, because you think that your suffering in old age does no harm to you in your youth, or instead in engaging in the Bodhisattva deeds, what we study now. It would be like not alleviating the pain in your foot with your hand because your foot is other. Old age and youth, or similarly former and future lives, are just illustrations. This principle applies also to the morning and evening, former and latter days, and so forth. So then with respect to the Kwam, but old age and youth are one continuum and the foot and hand are one collection. Therefore, they're not the same as self and other. The response is continuum and collection are designated to many moments and to many parts. They do not have self-sufficient essence. The self of yourself and the self of others must be posited to a collection and a continuum. So self and other are not established by way of an essence that can be posited independently. In other words, self and others do not exist inherently. They do not exist independently. Also, the self of yourself and the self of others must be posited independence upon a collection and a continuum, and therefore they do not exist independently or inherently. However, since beginningless time, you have found your own suffering unbearable because you have conditioned to self-cherishing. Therefore, if you become conditioned to cherishing others, you will give rise to an attitude of finding others' suffering unbearable. So far we spoke about the equality of self and others. Actually, there's one more resistance or argument that Shantideva presents here, which we spoke about today in verse 104. Abandoning objection. It is not valid to say that a bodhisattva himself falls prey to suffering by reflecting on the suffering of sentient beings, right? So if I meditate on others' suffering to meditate compassion, I will become unhappy. Verse 104 says, since compassion will multiply suffering greatly, why should I diligently develop it? The response is, if one were to contemplate the suffering of migrating beings, how could the suffering of compassion be more? So I think that's kind of one way to think about it is that I think that as Geshe said, there could be some momentary unhappiness or a sense of malaise when you think of other people's suffering, particularly when you think of these severe cases, when you look at, for example, what's happening at a slaughterhouse. So when you see a certain area that is affected by great conflict, mass murders, or when you encounter a bunch of people, group of people that are suffering greatly, it's hard not to be affected by it. So of course we are affected by it, but still we can say that it is experiencing a smaller level of suffering in order to accomplish a great result. But then also after that, Shantideva says, not only you will not be severely tormented, if you accustom yourself to thinking of alleviating the suffering of sentient beings, you will actually find joy and delight in it. So I think that with that we can, for me, it's always helpful to think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Lama Zopa Rinpoche. That kind of, I guess, that are the most striking example of people that have developed this compassion to an extent that it seems that although personally on a physical level they might be experiencing pain or suffering, still compassion overrides that. They do not despair. So look at, for example, Lama Zopa Rinpoche after the stroke. Now, we said it a few times that it seems that sometimes kind of we have sometimes a slight pain in part of our body, or kind of we feel fatigue, so we cannot even bring ourselves to do a short prostration. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, with kind of half of his body being paralyzed, whenever he gives teaching, he does full body prostration. Yeah. So Chuki is saying that when Lama Zopa Rinpoche was in hospital after the stroke, he was making jokes about his hand being paralyzed and not moving, and they were quite taken back by that, because you could say that the normal reaction would be to be depressed about it, but that was Lama Zopa Rinpoche's way of making everyone easy and comfortable, not only the students but also the staff at the hospital. Also, I think that Elsa, I think that told me before that when he was in hospital, she was there also, and what he was mainly concerned about was blessing the beds of the other patients in the hospital rather than taking care of himself. So so that's one example. A few days ago, I was translating for Serkong Rinpoche, who mentioned that that event from, I think it was 2001, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was at Bodh Gaya. It was supposed to give it a Kala Chakra empowerment, and he got sick and he was unable to do that. So there were, I think, as far as I remember, was there at the time, there were about 250,000 people that came from all over the Buddhist world to attain the Kala Chakra empowerment, and he got sick and was not able to give that empowerment. He had different things, but amongst that, he had, I think that second Rinpoche said he had gallbladder issue, or maybe, as far as I remember, he just had like severe food poisoning or something. Anyway, it was on his way to the hospital, and he said that he was suffering greatly, but he saw the poverty in that area on the way to the hospital. People lined up in the street, and during the Kala Chakra empowerment in Bodh Gaya in India, there are thousands of beggars that come from all across India in order to beg for food and medicine and so forth. So it's quite confronting to see the poverty and the sickness, the suffering of people. So His Honor says that he was looking kind of, while he was suffering from severe pain, he was looking at other people suffering outside. And by the time they go to the hospital, it seems that his suffering became somewhat lesser. So, so I think that, and also just kind of to think of the demeanor, the kind of the happy and joyful demeanor of His Honor, the Dalai Lama and Lama Zopa Rinpoche. In no way they become depressed and gloomy or being unable to do anything about the situation when they meditate on compassion. So that's kind of something to think about when we think of, when we worry whether we'll become completely overwhelmed or fatigued by suffering. So anyway, looking at how the commentary explains that in verse 104, it could be argued that when we consider the suffering of ourselves, compassion induces in us the feeling of great and unbearable sorrow. Given therefore that all sorrow is to be removed, what is the purpose of generating the pain of compassion, whether in yourself or in others? In answer to this, it should be argued that we only need to think about the sufferings of beings in hell. How could the smart of our compassion be considered intense compared with such agony? So that's another point of view, kind of when you think of, if you're going to meditate on the suffering of others and it's going to make you suffer, well, think about actually others who are suffering, like for example, in the hells. So if you think that, poor me, I'm suffering because I'm meditating on compassion, it is nothing in comparison with the suffering of others, which I think that probably, I think that maybe that's the message from the story about His Honor Dalai Lama suffering from pain and seeing other people in the street that no one takes care of. So then in verse 105, it continues in saying, if by one suffering, much suffering would be destroyed, kind people would produce it for themselves and others. And then thus, Supusha Chandra, although aware of the harm the king would cause him, did not prevent his own suffering because it would eradicate the suffering of many. So just to read through these two verses, the commentary to these two verses. And even though one may suffer, but by virtue of compassion, it is as when a wound is inflicted on the body for the purposes of curing a disease or getting the needle in order to be vaccinated or in order to be, if you have, for example, strong pain and you need to get some, you need to be anesthetized. No, so it'd be kind of quite funny to think that I'm scared of the needle if it can actually anesthetize you. Anyway, even though one may suffer by virtue of compassion, it is as when a wound inflicted on the body for the purpose of curing a disease. If it is by the single pain of a compassionate person that the many sufferings of other beings are removed, then loving persons must surely foster such pain both in themselves and other practitioners. Now, there was this reference to Surupushpa Chandra. So this commentary gives kind of this story. It says, the sorrow of compassion is therefore something to be cultivated. It was thus that the Bodhisattva Supushpa Chandra, clairvoyantly aware that the king would kill him, did not turn away. In order to remove the suffering of many other beings, he himself did not shy away from pain. On the contrary, he earnestly embraced it. The story is recounted in the Samadhi Raja Sutra, the King of Concentration Sutra. At a time when the doctrine of an earlier Buddha, Ratna Padma Chandra, was in decline, the monk Supushpa Chandra lived together with a host of 7,000 bodhisattvas in the forest called Samantabhadra. He was gifted with second sight, and he knew that if he were to go and teach in the jeweled place of King Viradatta, many millions of beings would gain high rebirth or liberations in the state of non-returner. None of this would happen if he failed to go. On the other hand, he knew that if he went, the king would kill him. And so he went to the palace and fasted for 7 days. At night, he circumambulated a stupa that contained relics consisting of the fingernails of one of the Buddhas. And during the day, he taught the Dharma in all the villages around. He placed an inconceivable number of beings in the higher realms and in the level of non-returners. After he died, killed on the order of the king by Udayana, the executioner, the king himself repented, built a stupa for Supushpa Chandra's bones and made offerings before it. So today we also covered the benefits of the equalizing self with others, but I think that this is quite straightforward. I think that if you read again through those verses in the commentary, it is quite straightforward. I think that the problems is the resistance that we have with equalizing self with others, and for that reason we spoke about it more at length. So before we leave it here for now, I want to go to the first question today. If you were to summarize equalizing self with others in 3 or 4 lines, how would you meditate on that? Could you attempt to explain it? Just be practical about it. Or you want to think about it more? Because I'm hearing thick silence. All right. I'm not going to give you my view of that or my attempt on that. I'll put it in the review questions. And see how you go with that. Do unto others. Yeah. All right. Any qualms or questions before we leave it here for now? All right, that's it. Due to this version, might quickly become a Guru Buddha and lead all transmigrative beings without exception to that state. May the precious Supreme Bodhicitta not yet born arise. May that reason not decline, but increase more and more. And since we mentioned His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, let's just do that. Please. In the land encircled by snowy mountains, you're the source of all happiness and good, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso. Please remain until samsara ends. You uphold the Subu's moral way of selves and the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplishes magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels. Protect them from myself and others, your disciples. Please, please live long. Yeah, Jen, I will send it to Kathy now. Thank you. I promise.